Welcome to Fraud Friday. I'm Bob Coleman. Today I want to talk about Charlie Javice. Now, you've all read about her. She was the fraudster sentenced to over 7 years, 85 months, to fraud for selling a fake user list to JPMorgan Chase. What I want to talk about is because she sold to a bank, she opened up herself to other fraud charges, i.e. lying to a bank, and that's part of the story that hasn't been covered. She was convicted on counts of bank fraud, wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy. Plus, also she has to forfeit $175 million, which is a financial death penalty. This is what she did. She represented that she had 4.25 million users to chase. Reality, it was 300,000. She acquired external data lists, and what she did is she went to a economics professor, an IT guy, and they made up all these lists and sent them over to Chase. Chase was very interested in that list. So they saw this as a great way to get into these young professionals, and they could form a lifelong relationship with these people just out of college. So you can imagine the marketing powerhouse that list could provide. They were so keen on closing that deal quickly, they didn't do due diligence. As I said, her own engineer said, no, we're not going to touch this. So she went outside. The buzzword is synthetic data. She made all this stuff up. She made up names. She made up email addresses, and only, less than 10%, 8% were only valid. So there was a serious lapse on the Chase due diligence side. She marketed future adoption and activity based on these inflated bases. She signed a contract. They gave her a nice office and say, hey, you run this project. And of course, none of that happened. But this is what I want to talk about for Fraud Friday. Because she lied to the bank, that triggered additional scrutiny by the prosecutors. If she had sold to another company, a fintech, yeah, she would have been subject to all these conspiracy and fraud charges. But because she sold to the bank and she lied to the bank, that added to her woes. And why is that? Well, for JPMorgan, this was an asset, and banks are highly regulated, and the regulators want to know, well, what is the value of your asset? You have this $175 million asset on the books. We want to know, what does that consist of? Why is that important? Because they take depositor funds. They're risking the funds of the depositors, which of course are insured by the FDIC, but in reality, Chase is a too big to fail bank. We saw that through the Great Recession, that the government would not allow this bank to fail, just as Silicon Valley Bank they deemed too big to fail. So taxpayer funds are at risk, and that is the issue. Because banks are held to rigorous internal controls, compliance, and audit standards, lying to them is viewed as undermining institutional safeguards. A non-bank buyer, by contrast, may tolerate greater ambiguity or accept more risk. In other words, if another company had bought this and the list was bogus and they had to write it off and they went through the normal bankruptcy proceedings, that's course of action. Businesses make bad decisions and would run its course. Of course, she would have been indicted for fraud. But in this particular case, her transaction risked taxpayer dollars, and that's why I find this particularly interesting. When a false metric is offered to a bank, it directly influences valuation risk models and regulatory decisions. In other words, Chase went to the regulator and say, hey, we have this strong balance sheet, and in banks, loans are assets, purchases are assets, and the regulator's job is to take a look at those assets and value them correctly. Is that asset really worth $175 million? This fraud unraveled very, very quickly. They did a test marketing, and when they found out that 90% of the emails bounced, and then they did a quick look at the spreadsheet and saw, I think this is made up, it quickly unraveled. Defrauding a bank provokes deeper regulatory and prosecutorial scrutiny. due to its systematic implications for financial stability and trust. Defrauding a non-bank is less likely to trigger such heightened resources or criminal pursuit. I don't know if I agree with that statement that I just wrote. Obviously, Enron, when there's fraud, the Department of Justice, the FBI, they're very interested in this type of transaction. Normally, though, it impacts shareholders, and that is limited to those investors. Here, it impacts the entire United States economy. I'll go there. Fraud involving a bank is treated as higher risk under the federal sentencing guidelines, very important, and often draws upward adjustments for sophistication, loss, and evasion. In this case, the question is, Bob, how much more of those 85 months would have been enhanced due to the bank fraud? Because of the size of this fraud, I doubt very much, but she had the added weight placed on her and the added scrutiny for this transaction. She's going to be serving a long time in jail, and this is many takeaways, but one is, if it's too good to be true, Chase thought it was. They were in a hurry to close the deal, and $175 million for 300 users was not even close. Thank you for joining me. My name is Bob Coleman. This is Fraud Friday.